On a hot summer afternoon in 1975, Jimmy Hoffa, the most powerful labor leader America had ever known, stepped into a suburban Detroit parking lot and vanished without a trace. He was a man who had risen from the dirt of the Great Depression, battled presidents, courted gangsters, and ruled the Teamsters with an iron fist. But when old alliances turned sour and ambition clashed with betrayal, the king of American labor learned a brutal truth. In the world he helped create, loyalty was a dangerous illusion. In the years that followed, his disappearance would ignite the greatest manhunt in U.S. history, fuel endless theories, and carve his name into the heart of American legend. This is the story of power, corruption, loyalty, and silence. This is the story of the man who became America's greatest unsolved mystery. This is the mysterious disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. The 30th of July, 1975. The summer heat clung to the streets of suburban Detroit like a damp blanket. Jimmy Hoffa sat behind the wheel of his green Pontiac Grandville, drumming his thick fingers against the steering wheel. His watch glinted in the sunlight. It was almost 2:30 p.m., a half hour past the scheduled meeting time. The Marcus Red Fox restaurant loomed across the parking lot, an upscale joint where businessmen and mobsters alike rubbed shoulders over steaks and cocktails. Hoffa checked his watch again. He wasn't a man accustomed to waiting, especially not for Anthony Tony Provenzano, a feared capo in the Genovese crime family, and Anthony Giacalone, a local Detroit mob boss. Both men had allegedly agreed to a sit-down today, a meeting that could decide Hoffa's future in the Teamsters or seal his fate. Hoffa, now 62, had spent the past year plotting his return to power. After serving 4 years in prison for jury tampering and fraud, he wasn't ready to fade into history. He wanted his throne back, but reclaiming it meant confronting the very men who had filled the power vacuum in his absence, men who had no intention of stepping aside quietly. Across the street, a maroon Mercury Marquis idled, its windows tinted dark. Two men inside watched Hoffa intently. One of them, a heavy-set figure with a cigar clamped between his teeth, muttered something under his breath and checked a .38 revolver tucked under his jacket. At 2:45 p.m., Hoffa stepped out of his car. Dressed in a navy sport coat and tie, his thick white hair slicked back, he looked every bit the labor titan he once was. He headed toward the restaurant entrance but stopped short, noticing no familiar faces inside. His brow furrowed in frustration. Had he been stood up? Across the lot, the door of the Mercury Marquis creaked open. What happened next remains a mystery. Witnesses later claimed they saw Hoffa speaking with 2 or 3 men by his car before getting into another vehicle. Others said he was forced. Some heard nothing at all, just the hum of traffic and the buzz of insects in the late afternoon heat. By nightfall, Jimmy Hoffa had vanished off the face of the earth. His wife, Josephine, worried sick when he missed dinner, called the police by midnight. Hoffa's green Grandville was still parked neatly outside the Marcus Red Fox. His keys were in the ignition. His loyalty pin was still clipped to his lapel. But Jimmy Hoffa, the bulldog of American labor, the man who had stood toe-to-toe with gangsters, senators, and presidents, was gone. And in his place, only questions. Long before he became a kingmaker before the flashing cameras, the courtroom battles, and the whispered threats, Jimmy Hoffa was just a scrappy kid with fire in his belly. Born on Valentine's Day, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana, Hoffa learned early that life offered no easy victories. His father, a coal miner, died when Jimmy was only 7, leaving his mother, Viola, to raise 4 children on her own. The family moved to Detroit in search of opportunity, but the Motor City during the Great Depression was a place where survival demanded grit and guts. At just 14 years old, Hoffa quit school to work full-time, helping to put food on the table. He wasn't a big man, barely 5'5", but he made up for it with a volcanic temper and a relentless drive that intimidated men twice his size. By 17, Hoffa was working at a Kroger warehouse, enduring brutal hours for meager pay. It was there that Hoffa first glimpsed the true enemy, corporate greed. Supervisors treated workers like disposable parts, firing them at will, forcing them to toil without breaks, without safety measures, without dignity. Hoffa couldn't stomach it. He organized his first strike at Kroger, leading his fellow workers in a bold standoff. They refused to unload a shipment of strawberries until the company agreed to better conditions. It was a small victory, but it tasted sweet. It was also the moment Hoffa realized his gift. He could rally men, command loyalty, and bend stubborn institutions to his will. Word spread. A recruiter from the Teamsters, then a scrappy underdog union struggling against the more established labor groups, spotted Hoffa's raw talent. They brought him aboard, and Hoffa never looked back. In those early days, union organizing was dangerous business. Hoffa carried a baseball bat more often than he carried a picket sign. He was no stranger to alleyway beatings, threats, or sabotage. But he didn't flinch. If anything, the danger hardened him, giving him a taste for power and the knowledge that muscle, as much as negotiation, ruled the labor world. By the 1930s, Jimmy Hoffa had become a rising star in the Detroit branch of the Teamsters. His blend of street smarts, charm, and unshakable loyalty to his men made him a force to be reckoned with. He built a personal army, a network of drivers, warehousemen, and dock workers who would do anything for him. He knew every man's name, every family's hardship. To Hoffa, the union wasn't just a job, it was a brotherhood, one worth fighting for, one worth dying for. But loyalty came with a price. As the Teamsters grew in power, so did the interest of organized crime. They saw in Hoffa a useful ally, a leader who could control ports, trucking routes, and money streams that ran across the country like blood through veins. Hoffa, never one to shy away from pragmatism, made a choice: to work with the mob if it meant strengthening the union. It was a decision that would propel him to unimaginable heights and one day drag him into darkness. But for now, in the smoky union halls of Detroit, Jimmy Hoffa was a rising titan, a man destined to remake the American labor movement in his own fierce image. And nothing, not cops, not bosses, not even the mob was going to stop him. By the mid-1940s, Jimmy Hoffa had risen from a Detroit organizer to one of the most feared and respected figures in the entire labor world. But he wasn't satisfied. Not yet. He had bigger plans, plans to transform the Teamsters from a regional player into the most powerful union America had ever seen. And he would do it by any means necessary. Hoffa's strategy was simple and brutal. Control the drivers, control the country. Trucks moved everything: food, steel, oil, medicine. If the Teamsters controlled the trucking routes, they could squeeze industries by the throat. Cities would starve. Factories would shut down. Politicians would beg for mercy. He traveled non-stop, moving from city to city, small town to small town, forging alliances and crushing resistance. If a local trucking company refused to sign with the union, Hoffa didn't just picket, he unleashed hell. Tires were slashed. Warehouses mysteriously caught fire. Non-union drivers found themselves locked out, beaten, or worse. At organizing rallies, Hoffa was magnetic. He spoke not like a politician, but like one of them: tough, plain, relentless. He promised workers better pay, better hours, better lives, and he delivered. Membership surged. Between 1,940 and 1,952, the Teamsters grew from a modest-sized union into a monster, boasting hundreds of thousands of members across dozens of states. Hoffa's charisma wasn't the only thing fueling this explosion. Money, serious money, began pouring into the union's coffers. Dues, pension funds, and negotiated kickbacks became rivers of cash flowing under Hoffa's control. He wasn't shy about using that money to grease palms, win elections, or reward loyalty. And where money flowed, the mob followed. It was a marriage of convenience. Mobsters needed influence over the transportation industry. Hoffa needed muscle enforcers who could keep rivals in check, intimidate wayward employers, and, if necessary, silence troublemakers. Hoffa brokered deals with mafia figures like Russell Bufalino, Carlos Marcello, and Anthony Provenzano, treating them not as criminals but as partners in his growing empire. Inside Teamsters headquarters, Hoffa ruled like a king. No detail was too small. He knew which local bosses were loyal, which ones might need a warning. He memorized birthdays, family tragedies, even the names of members' kids, a shrewd way of building loyalty deeper than fear alone. Still, enemies circled. Inside the Teamsters, ambitious underlings plotted. Rival unions seethed at the Teamsters' growing influence. And in Washington, politicians and prosecutors grew alarmed as Hoffa's union began acting more like a shadow government than a workers' organization. In 1952, Hoffa's power culminated when he helped engineer the rise of Dave Beck as the Teamsters' national president, setting the stage for Hoffa himself to take full control a few years later. To the world outside, Hoffa was a controversial figure, a man who blurred the lines between labor rights and organized crime. But to the rank-and-file members, he was a hero. He had given them dignity, power, and paychecks fat enough to buy homes, cars, and futures for their children. And for Hoffa, the sky was the limit. He wasn't just building a union. He was building a kingdom. And soon, he would have to defend it with everything he had. Jimmy Hoffa had always understood one brutal truth. Power never survives on virtue alone. You needed friends in high places and sometimes, even more importantly, friends in low ones. By the early 1950s, Hoffa was no longer just brushing elbows with gangsters. He was embracing them, not with naive trust, but with cold, mutual understanding. Organized crime and organized labor, two worlds driven by loyalty, fear, and control, found in Hoffa the perfect bridge. The Teamsters Pension Fund, swollen with dues from nearly 1 million workers, became a glittering prize. Billions of dollars sat in those accounts, money meant for retirements and hospitals. Hoffa realized it could also be a tool, a way to lend and launder enormous sums to mob-connected businesses, casinos, real estate ventures, and trucking companies that could turn favors when needed. Men like Anthony Tony Provenzano, a ruthless capo in the Genovese family, and Russell Bufalino, the quiet but lethal boss from Pennsylvania, became close allies. In exchange for union contracts, they offered protection, votes, and if things turned ugly, muscle. Hoffa didn't see it as corruption. He saw it as survival. In smoky back rooms across the country, Las Vegas, Chicago, New York, Detroit, the deals were struck. Millions of dollars moved under the table. Hoffa's Teamsters bankrolled the rapid explosion of Vegas casinos, many of which were nothing more than mob fronts. In return, the mobsters guaranteed the Teamsters' growing dominance over the trucking routes and docks. It was a golden age, but it was built on a rotten foundation. Violence became an accepted currency. Business agents who refused to play ball sometimes disappeared. Competitors who tried to break Hoffa's stranglehold ended up hospitalized or buried in shallow graves. Hoffa rarely got his hands dirty directly. He didn't have to. His message was understood without needing to be spoken. Even inside the Teamsters, Hoffa faced betrayal. Some officers, hungry for a piece of the growing power, conspired against him. He crushed them with surgical precision blackmail, rigged elections, and the occasional midnight visit from men who didn't ask twice. At night, behind closed doors, Hoffa sometimes wondered if he had crossed the line too far. But in the daylight, when he stood in front of thousands of cheering Teamsters, waving banners and singing his name, all doubt vanished. He was their protector. He was their champion. And if he had to deal with the devil to build a future for his men, then so be it. But across the country, in the polished halls of Washington, D.C., powerful new enemies were watching Hoffa's rise with growing alarm. Men who would stop at nothing to bring him crashing down. And in the shadows, even his friends in low places were beginning to wonder, had Jimmy Hoffa become too powerful for his own good? For every empire, there comes a reckoning. For Jimmy Hoffa, that reckoning came dressed in an impeccable suit with a name that would haunt him for the rest of his life: Robert F. Kennedy. Young, ambitious, and burning with moral outrage, Bobby Kennedy was everything Hoffa despised: a privileged son of wealth, determined to dismantle everything Hoffa had built. As chief counsel for the Senate's McClellan Committee, Kennedy made it his personal mission to root out corruption in organized labor, and at the top of his hit list stood one man, James Riddle Hoffa. The clash was immediate, and it was war. In televised hearings, Kennedy grilled Hoffa with a prosecutor's cold fury. Hoffa, for his part, met him with thinly veiled contempt, responding with sarcasm, stonewalling, and outright threats masked behind a working man's smile. The American public, glued to their televisions, watched the spectacle unfold. Kennedy portrayed Hoffa as a kingpin of crime, a labor leader who had sold out his union brothers to gangsters. Hoffa portrayed Kennedy as a spoiled rich kid who didn't understand the realities of fighting for the working man. Both men were partly right. Both men were entirely relentless. Behind the scenes, the attacks grew even dirtier. Kennedy's investigators tailed Hoffa's associates, tapped phones, dug through garbage. Hoffa, in turn, used his vast network of loyalists to intimidate witnesses, spread false rumors, and launch counter-investigations into Kennedy's team. Each subpoena, each grand jury summons, each indictment only seemed to harden Hoffa's image among his followers. In their eyes, he wasn't just a union leader anymore, he was a martyr, fighting a system rigged against the working class. But Kennedy was patient, methodical. He knew Hoffa had skeletons buried deep. It was only a matter of time before one of them rose to the surface. Meanwhile, Hoffa's enemies weren't limited to Washington. Inside the Teamsters, younger, hungrier men, some with their own mob ties, began whispering that Hoffa had made too many enemies, drawn too much heat. Maybe it was time for a change. Maybe the old bulldog was past his prime. Still, Hoffa pressed on, defiant. In 1957, his ambition reached a new peak. With Dave Beck, his predecessor, crippled by corruption charges, Hoffa ascended to the presidency of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. It was his crowning achievement. He stood atop the largest, richest, most feared union in American history. But the crown came heavy. Investigations intensified. FBI surveillance closed in. Even some of his mob friends began to worry that Hoffa's growing notoriety would eventually expose them all. In Hoffa's mind, he was untouchable. His empire was too vast, his grip too strong. His enemies were nothing more than gnats buzzing around a lion. He didn't realize, not yet, that the walls were already closing in. And the fall, when it came, would be brutal. By the early 1960s, the storm Hoffa had long defied finally broke over his head. Years of relentless investigations, betrayals, and mounting evidence brought the unthinkable, criminal indictments. Not just one, several. The charges varied: jury tampering, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy. But at their core, they all told the same story. Kennedy and his allies had been screaming for years that Hoffa had built his empire not just on loyalty and hard work, but on intimidation, bribery, and deals made in smoke-filled back rooms. At first, Hoffa fought back with the fury of a man who had never lost a battle. He spent millions from the Teamsters' vast treasury hiring the best defense lawyers in the country. He accused the Justice Department of a witch hunt, painting himself as a martyr for the working class. At rallies, Teamsters still chanted his name, waving signs that read, "Leave our Jimmy alone." But behind closed doors, cracks were forming. Some of Hoffa's oldest allies began to drift away, fearful of being caught in the dragnet. Mob bosses who had once pledged loyalty whispered behind his back, questioning whether their golden goose had become more trouble than he was worth. The first trial, a jury tampering case in Tennessee, ended in mistrial under suspicious circumstances. But Kennedy's forces weren't finished. They dug deeper. They pushed harder. In 1964, after years of legal warfare, Jimmy Hoffa was convicted of both jury tampering and misuse of Teamster pension funds. The sentence was devastating: 13 years in federal prison. Hoffa was livid. He railed against the courts. He promised to appeal, to fight, to come back stronger than ever. Privately, though, the defeat stung deeper than anything he had ever endured. He wasn't just losing his freedom. He was losing the throne he had spent a lifetime clawing his way toward. As Hoffa prepared for prison, forces within the Teamsters moved against him. Frank Fitzsimmons, once a loyal lieutenant, was installed as acting president, a move heavily encouraged by mob figures eager to see a less volatile figure in charge. In public, Fitzsimmons pledged loyalty to Hoffa. In private, he began dismantling Hoffa's influence, cutting deals with politicians and mob bosses alike to ensure the old king would never return. On the 7th of March, 1967, Hoffa surrendered to federal authorities. As he walked into the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, cameras flashing, Hoffa held his head high. But inside, rage and betrayal boiled. He vowed it wasn't over. He would serve his time, yes, but he would not be forgotten. He would return. And when he did, he would tear down the house brick by brick if he had to. But what Hoffa didn't know, couldn't yet see, was that the world outside was already moving on without him. And not everyone was eager to see Jimmy Hoffa walk free again. Prison was supposed to break Jimmy Hoffa. It didn't. Inside the walls of Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, Hoffa plotted not just survival, but a return to power. He paced his cell like a caged lion, writing letters, sketching strategies, sending coded messages through visitors and loyalists on the outside. He refused to see himself as a defeated man. He was a warrior serving time behind enemy lines. From the beginning, Hoffa made it clear to everyone, inmates, guards, visitors, that he intended to reclaim the presidency of the Teamsters the moment he walked out. No retirement, no surrender. But the landscape had changed. On the outside, Frank Fitzsimmons had consolidated power. He made peace with the government, cozying up to politicians Hoffa had once treated with open contempt. Under Fitzsimmons, the Teamsters' leadership became softer, more compliant, and far more comfortable for the mob. The mafia bosses liked Fitzsimmons. He was manageable, predictable. Hoffa, in contrast, was a bomb they could no longer control, and that terrified them. Still, Hoffa pressed on. He maintained contact with old allies still loyal to him. He orchestrated campaign plans, rallying Teamster locals in secret, laying the groundwork for an aggressive run for office once he was released. But freedom would not come easily. Hoffa needed political leverage, and he found it, ironically, through the very system that had caged him. In 1971, after spending nearly 5 years behind bars, Hoffa secured a stunning deal: a presidential commutation from Richard Nixon. Nixon, eager to court support from organized labor and allegedly influenced by promises of Teamster campaign donations, agreed to commute Hoffa's sentence on one critical condition. Jimmy Hoffa was banned from engaging in union activities until 1980. On paper, it was a death sentence for Hoffa's ambitions. In reality, Hoffa viewed it as just another obstacle to crush. He immediately announced he would challenge the restrictions, sue the government, and fight his way back into leadership. The mob bosses, who had reluctantly backed Fitzsimmons, were now furious. They had counted on Hoffa fading quietly into the background. Instead, he was once again at their doorstep, pounding his fist, demanding his crown back. Threats started surfacing subtle at first. Warnings whispered through intermediaries. Stay out of the Teamsters. Let it go. Retire peacefully. But Hoffa didn't listen. He never had. In 1974 and 1975, Hoffa ramped up his comeback efforts, meeting with old Teamster locals, gathering support, promising to bring the union back to the days of real power, days when the men in suits feared the men in work boots. He even agreed to secret sit-downs with mob figures like Anthony Provenzano, men he once counted as allies, in a desperate attempt to broker a deal. But the meetings went badly. Tempers flared. Old betrayals resurfaced. Hoffa realized, too late, that he was walking a razor's edge. He had lost the one thing that had protected him for so long: fear. The men who once needed him now saw him as a liability. And Jimmy Hoffa didn't know how to stop fighting. His comeback plan was in full motion. But somewhere in the shadows, others were making plans of their own. plans that didn't include Hoffa's return or Hoffa's survival. The summer of 1975 simmered with tension. Jimmy Hoffa had pushed too hard, too fast. Despite repeated warnings, veiled threats, calls from old friends, subtle signs that his comeback plan was angering the wrong people, Hoffa pressed on like a man who could not be intimidated because he had never learned how to be. In late July, Hoffa arranged a crucial meeting. The location: the Macus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a quiet suburb north of Detroit. The purpose: a sit-down with two heavy hitters from the mob world, Anthony Tony Provenzano, a volatile and dangerous Genovese family capo, and Anthony Giacalone, a smooth-talking Detroit mobster with deep connections. Hoffa believed that if he could broker peace, if he could assure the old guard he wasn't a threat to their money pipeline, he could muscle his way back into the Teamsters' leadership, or at least carve out a seat at the table. It was a dangerous gamble. Hoffa told his wife, Josephine, about the meeting. He told his trusted associates. He even confided in his closest Teamster friends that he didn't trust Tony Pro, that there was bad blood between them. Unsolved grudges over broken promises, past betrayals, and prison time slights. Still, Hoffa planned to go. At around 1 p.m. on the 30th of July, 1975, Hoffa left his lakeside home in his green Pontiac Granville. He stopped briefly at the office of a family friend, dropped off some paperwork, then headed toward the Machu's Red Fox. He pulled into the restaurant's parking lot at 2 p.m. early for a 2:30 p.m. meeting. He waited. The minutes dragged on. The sun bore down. Witnesses later reported seeing Hoffa pacing in the lot, growing visibly agitated. At around 2:45 p.m., something shifted. Some witnesses claimed Hoffa was approached by 2 or 3 men. Others said he willingly got into a maroon Mercury Marquis that had been idling nearby. One account suggested Hoffa recognized the men, trusted them enough to lower his guard. Another whispered theory said he was pushed into the car under the guise of a friendly conversation that turned suddenly dark. One fact remained: Jimmy Hoffa was never seen alive again. That evening, when Hoffa didn't return home for dinner, something he never failed to do, Josephine grew worried. She made phone calls. She drove to the Machu's Red Fox. There was his car, parked neatly, the keys still in the ignition. But no Hoffa. By midnight, she called the police. By dawn, the story had exploded into national headlines. Jimmy Hoffa, the indestructible titan of American labor, had vanished. In the coming days, the FBI descended on Detroit, launching one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. Restaurants, fields, farms, and even trash dumps were scoured. Teamsters officials were dragged into questioning. Mob figures suddenly found themselves under new, blinding scrutiny. But it was as if Hoffa had been swallowed whole by the earth. No body, no definitive witnesses, no hard evidence. Only a gaping hole, where one of the most powerful men in America had once stood, and a rising chorus of theories, betrayals, and whispered confessions that would stretch on for decades. In the aftermath of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, law enforcement had no shortage of suspects. The trouble was, they all had motive. They all had opportunity. And none of them were talking. At the top of the list stood 2 names that echoed like gunshots through Detroit streets: Anthony Tony Provenzano and Anthony Tony Giacalone. Both men were seasoned operators, mobsters, who played chess with people's lives, and both had been tied directly to the meeting Hoffa had scheduled on the 30th of July, 1975. Tony Pro was an especially volatile figure. During their time in prison, Hoffa and Provenzano had clashed violently over union control, money owed, and personal insults that had curdled into long-standing hatred. Hoffa had called Tony Pro a punk to his face, a slight that Provenzano never forgot and never forgave. Witnesses close to Hoffa said he dreaded the meeting with Tony Pro but felt he had no choice. It was a final attempt to bury old grudges for the sake of his comeback. Tony Giacalone, the Detroit mob street boss, was equally dangerous, but smarter. Tony Jack was a master of appearances, using business fronts and political connections to mask his underworld dealings. He had reportedly agreed to help mediate the meeting between Hoffa and Provenzano, but Giacalone was no peacemaker. He was a tactician, and he had every reason to make sure Hoffa's reappearance on the national stage never happened. FBI agents immediately zeroed in on both men after Hoffa vanished. Giacalone and Provenzano claimed they had no idea what Hoffa was talking about, that no meeting had ever been scheduled, that they had airtight alibis. Tony Pro was reportedly playing cards with his crew in New Jersey. Tony Jack claimed he had been at the Southfield Athletic Club, visiting with friends. On paper, the alibis checked out. In reality, nobody in law enforcement believed them. Still, without a body, without an eyewitness willing to talk, and without hard evidence tying them to a crime, there was little the FBI could do. Other names floated to the surface, adding more shadows to the picture. Chucky O'Brien, Hoffa's longtime aide, a man Hoffa treated like a son. O'Brien was reportedly seen driving the same maroon Mercury Marquis that may have picked Hoffa up that day. He denied involvement, claiming he was running errands for a fish delivery. But the stink of betrayal clung to him, and Hoffa's family would never forgive him. Salvatore Sally Bugs Briguglio, a Provenzano lieutenant, a quiet, cold-eyed killer with a reputation for making people disappear cleanly. Some whispered that Sally Bugs was the one who physically ended Hoffa's life that day. Frank the Irishman, Sheeran, a Teamster official and mob enforcer with connections to both Hoffa and Russell Bufalino. Years later, in deathbed confessions, Sheeran would claim he had been ordered to take care of Hoffa and that he had obeyed. The deeper investigators dug, the more tangled the web became. No one talked. No one cracked. In the mafia world, silence wasn't just loyalty, it was survival. The FBI knew Hoffa hadn't just run off. They knew he hadn't faked his own death. They knew, in their gut, that his old friends had decided he was too dangerous to be left alive. The question was no longer who wanted Hoffa gone. It was who had pulled the trigger and where the body had gone. And as months dragged into years, even that grim trail began to grow cold. Jimmy Hoffa was not the kind of man who would go quietly. And yet, on the 30th of July, 1975, he vanished so completely that it seemed as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. In the weeks that followed his disappearance, the FBI worked feverishly to piece together what had happened, but the clues were frustratingly few. No witnesses had seen violence. No bloodstains were found in the parking lot. Hoffa's car was untouched, and his wallet, his union ring, his watch all left behind. It was as if someone had waved a hand and made him disappear into smoke. Privately, agents came to believe a grim but simple theory. Hoffa had been lured into a car by men he knew and trusted, or at least believed he could talk sense into. Once inside, he had likely been overpowered quickly and efficiently. There were no reports of a struggle, no cries for help, which meant, whatever happened, it happened fast. Some theories said Hoffa was driven to a safe house nearby, possibly a mob-owned residence where he was killed almost immediately. Others believed he was taken to a secluded area and disappeared before he ever knew what was happening. According to later accounts, some credible, some not Hoffa, may have been strangled. A quick, silent death. A method favored by mob assassins to avoid noise, blood, and witnesses. From there, the possibilities multiplied. Theory 1. His body was loaded into a truck possibly belonging to a trusted Teamster affiliate and transported out of the area, either to an industrial site, a remote farm, or a mafia-controlled landfill. Theory 2. Hoffa's remains were cremated within hours at a mob-connected funeral home, leaving no trace. Theory 3. He was buried under one of Detroit's many construction sites, possibly even under the foundations of a new building or a bridge, where concrete and steel would forever entomb him. Theory 4. Some whispered that Hoffa's body was stuffed into a 55-gallon steel drum and dropped into the Great Lakes, never to be found again. Each theory had its believers. Each was supported by shadowy sources, dead-end tips, and deathbed confessions. But no theory ever produced the one thing the authorities needed: a body. And without a body, there could be no murder charge, no trial, no official justice. By late 1975, public interest in the case was at a fever pitch. Every few weeks brought a new headline, a tip about a farm being dug up, a warehouse being raided, a river being dragged, but each search ended the same way: nothing. The FBI launched Operation Switchback, a multi-year, multi-million-dollar task force dedicated to solving Hoffa's disappearance. Hundreds of witnesses were interviewed. Thousands of pages of evidence were gathered. But it all led to the same black hole. Jimmy Hoffa was gone. And the people who knew the truth, the men who had likely lured him to his death, had buried their secrets as deep as Hoffa's body. As years passed, the truth blurred into legend. Theories turned into folk tales. Every old dock worker in Detroit had a cousin who knew a guy who had seen Hoffa buried under a stadium, a highway, or a horse farm. But the cold, brutal fact remained. On that hot July afternoon, Jimmy Hoffa was erased. Neatly, efficiently, permanently. And the men who had erased him melted back into the shadows, their silence sealed by blood, money, and fear. In Jimmy Hoffa's world, loyalty was supposed to be absolute. It was the code he lived by, the currency he trusted more than money, more than fear. But in the end, it was loyalty that killed him. The FBI quickly realized that Hoffa's disappearance wasn't just the work of external enemies. It wasn't just mob bosses pulling strings from cigar smoke rooms. It was someone close, someone Hoffa trusted, who had helped seal his fate: Chucky O'Brien. The name kept coming up over and over again. Chucky had been more than a chauffeur or an aide. He had been like a son to Hoffa. Hoffa had mentored him, protected him, given him opportunities nobody else would have. Yet on the day Hoffa vanished, Chucky was behind the wheel of a maroon Mercury Marquis, the same type of car witnesses reported seeing Hoffa approach in the Marcus Red Fox parking lot. Chucky claimed he had been running errands, delivering fish to a family friend. He insisted he had no knowledge of any plan to harm Hoffa. But the timing, the car, the connections to Provenzano's crew, it was too much to ignore. Did Chucky knowingly help set Hoffa up? Or had he been used a pawn whose familiarity would make Hoffa lower his guard long enough to be ambushed? The FBI leaned toward the latter. If Chucky had known what was about to happen, he didn't act like a man carrying that burden. More likely, they believed, he had been told to deliver Hoffa to the meeting spot, nothing more, while others handled the grim business afterward. Still, Chucky's actions haunted the investigation. And there were others too. Frank, the Irishman. Sheeran, a loyal Hoffa enforcer, a man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him, would later claim that he had been ordered by Russell Bufalino to kill Hoffa personally. According to Sheeran, he had driven Hoffa to a house, shot him twice behind the ear, and left the body for disposal. Sheeran's confession, though, came decades later, as he neared death, and skeptics pointed out that Sheeran may have exaggerated his role for fame, guilt, or both. Salvatore, Sally Bugs Briguglio, Provenzano's cold-blooded lieutenant, was also rumored to have been directly involved. Sally Bugs was a professional when it came to making problems disappear. If he was part of Hoffa's last ride, it would explain the clean efficiency of the operation. In the brutal world of organized crime, betrayal was inevitable. Friends became enemies in the blink of an eye. Loyalty was a blade that could turn against you without warning. But for Hoffa, a man who had built his life on brotherhood, who believed his word was stronger than any contract, the betrayal cut deeper than any bullet ever could. He trusted the wrong men. He leaned on friendships that had rotted from within. And when the final moment came, the faces he saw just before the darkness closed in were not the faces of strangers. They were the faces of brothers. brothers who had made a different kind of deal, brothers who had chosen survival over loyalty. Blood ties, it turned out, were just as easy to spill as any other. The day after Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, the FBI launched into action, but they were already playing from behind. The crime, if you could even call it that, had been executed flawlessly. No witnesses willing to talk, no obvious crime scene, no body. The first few hours were chaos. Detectives fanned out across Bloomfield Township, interviewing restaurant employees, nearby businesses, random passers-by. Dozens of Teamster officials were hauled in for questioning, many stonewalled. Others claimed ignorance. The Bureau knew time was against them. Every hour that passed was another hour for evidence to vanish, for conspirators to retreat deeper into the shadows. Still, they pushed forward with Operation Switchback, a sweeping, national-scale manhunt. They raided homes tied to Tony Giacalone, Anthony Provenzano, and other known mob affiliates. They dug into the Teamsters' pension records, hoping to expose financial corruption that might pressure suspects into flipping. Farms, warehouses, and abandoned lots across Michigan were searched. Sniffer dogs were brought in. Backhoes clawed up earth in grim, fruitless excavations. Tips poured in from all over the country, many from shady characters looking to cash in on the reward, others from cranks and conspiracy theorists. A rumor that Hoffa was buried under the Giants Stadium in New Jersey. A tip claiming he had been dissolved in acid at a chemical plant. A whisper that he had been shipped in a steel drum to Japan. Each lead was pursued. Each one collapsed into dead ends. The Mercury Marquis tied to Chucky O'Brien was seized and examined. Traces of Hoffa's hair were found in the vehicle, but no blood, no sign of violence, not enough for an indictment. Under mounting political pressure, the FBI offered immunity deals to known associates in exchange for information. No one took the bait. Omerta, the mafia's code of silence, held firm. Even when Sally Bugs, Briguglio, and other suspects were arrested on unrelated charges, none cracked under interrogation. If they knew anything about Hoffa's fate, they were taking it to the grave. Meanwhile, the media turned the story into a national obsession. Newspapers blared wild theories across front pages. News anchors speculated endlessly about what had happened and why. For years, Hoffa had been a household name loved by union workers, hated by corporate executives, feared by politicians. His vanishing act only deepened the myth. In death or presumed death, Jimmy Hoffa became larger than life. But for the men chasing his ghost, it was a brutal, exhausting battle. Every promising lead turned into another shovel of dirt thrown onto Hoffa's legacy. Every dead-end search painted a clearer picture. Whoever made Jimmy Hoffa disappear had done so with chilling precision and had powerful friends willing to keep the secret buried. And so the greatest manhunt in American history continued, year after year, chasing a man who had already become a ghost. By the late 1970s, it was clear. Jimmy Hoffa was not coming back. But the mystery of what had happened to him only grew, mutating into a tangle of theories, some wild, some chillingly believable, each one a different version of the final moments of Hoffa's life. The FBI had its favorites. Mob insiders had their whispered confessions. Amateur sleuths spun their own elaborate webs. Each theory tried to answer the same burning question. Where was Hoffa's body? Theory 1. Buried beneath Giants Stadium. One of the most famous theories claimed Hoffa had been murdered in Detroit, his body stuffed into a steel drum, and transported across state lines to New Jersey. There, he was supposedly buried under the concrete slabs of the newly constructed Giants Stadium. It was a delicious story, the idea that millions of football fans unknowingly stomped above the grave of America's most notorious missing man. But no real evidence ever surfaced. Years later, when parts of the stadium were demolished, no remains were found. Still, the legend lives on. Theory 2. Cremated immediately after death. Another chillingly simple theory. Hoffa's killers brought him to a mob-connected funeral home. There, his body was cremated in a high-temperature furnace used for disposing of biological waste long before police even realized he was missing. Cremation left no trace. No body. No crime scene. Just ash scattered to the wind. This theory gained traction because it explained the eerie, total absence of physical evidence. Theory 3. Dumped in a landfill or crushed in a car. Others claimed Hoffa's remains were dumped in a Detroit landfill, buried under layers of garbage, or compacted into the steel of a crushed car at a junkyard, controlled by the mob. Some insiders pointed to the Central Sanitation Services landfill in Hamtramck, Michigan, operated by Tony Provenzano's men. The FBI dug parts of it up. They found bones, but none that matched Hoffa's crude. A junkyard disposal would have been poetic, in a grim way. The man who once ruled American labor, reduced to scrap metal. Theory 4. Dumped into the Great Lakes. There were whispers that Hoffa's body had been weighed down and dropped into the dark, icy waters of the Great Lakes. Lake Michigan. Lake Erie. Take your pick. A body submerged in deep, cold waters would be virtually impossible to recover another perfect erasure. No concrete evidence ever emerged to support this theory, but its simplicity made it hauntingly believable. Theory 5. Shipped overseas. One of the more bizarre theories suggested that Hoffa's body was packed inside a steel drum, loaded onto a freighter at the port of Detroit, and shipped overseas, possibly to Japan or Italy, where it was dumped without ceremony. Again, no evidence ever confirmed this, but it had the same appeal: distance, disappearance, and no trail for investigators to follow. And then there were the confessions. In the 1990s and early 2000s, aging mobsters and Hoffa associates began confessing or pretending to confess to knowing what had happened. Frank Sheeran, in I Heard You Paint Houses, claimed he shot Hoffa inside a Detroit house. The house was later tested for blood traces, and forensic scientists did find blood, but it wasn't conclusively linked to Hoffa. Richard the Iceman Kuklinski, a hitman, claimed he had been paid to kill Hoffa and dispose of the body, a claim few experts took seriously. Each confession added layers to the legend, but no confession ever cracked the case wide open. The final truth? The simplest theory remains the most likely. Hoffa was lured into a car by men he trusted, killed quickly, and disposed of with terrifying efficiency. No theatrics, no elaborate schemes, just cold pragmatism by professionals who knew that the only way to kill a king was to make sure no body was ever found. In the end, Jimmy Hoffa didn't just vanish from a parking lot in suburban Detroit. He vanished from history itself, swallowed by loyalty, betrayal, and silence. When Jimmy Hoffa vanished, it was more than the end of a man, it was the end of an era. The shockwaves of his disappearance rippled far beyond Detroit. They echoed through the Teamsters, the mob, law enforcement, and American culture itself, leaving permanent scars. The Teamsters, without their king. Without Hoffa's iron fist guiding them, the Teamsters changed. Under Frank Fitzsimmons, the union became more compliant, less confrontational, and some said far more corrupt. Membership still grew, and money still flowed, but the swagger Hoffa had infused into the brotherhood faded. Fitzsimmons cozying up to political elites and business interests, things Hoffa would have called betrayal, became standard practice. Later, leaders tried to distance themselves from the old days, from the blood-soaked legends of Hoffa's reign. But the Teamsters' reputation for violence, corruption, and mob ties clung to them like smoke for decades. Even today, when people hear Teamsters, Hoffa's ghost isn't far behind. The Mafia's silent victory. For the Mafia, Hoffa's death was a grim necessity. He had become a liability, unpredictable, uncontrollable, too loud in a world that demanded silence. By eliminating Hoffa, the mob preserved its secret control over labor unions, pension funds, and construction contracts for years longer. But Hoffa's disappearance also drew an inferno of attention onto the underworld. The FBI doubled its efforts against organized crime, launching massive investigations like the Operation Donnie Brasco, infiltration of the Bonanno family, and the successful use of the RICO Act to dismantle entire mafia families in the 1980s. The mob may have won the battle, But Hoffa's ghost helped turn the tide in the longer war. Law enforcement's obsession, the Hoffa case, became the FBI's white whale. Agents who chased the mystery through the 1970s, 80s, and beyond described it as a career-defining and career-haunting experience. Every tip was a promise. Every dead end was a gut punch. Retirements came and went. New generations of agents inherited the case like an unsolvable riddle passed down through time. No body, no confession, no closure. It was everything law enforcement hated and everything the underworld loved. America's endless fascination. Hoffa's story seeped into American pop culture, becoming legend. Books, movies, songs, television specials, magazine covers asking, "Where's Hoffa?" even decades later. In a country obsessed with crime, loyalty, betrayal, and power, Hoffa's vanishing act became a symbol, a story too perfectly tragic to ever fully let go. He became an American myth, the labor king who rose from the dirt, who bent the system to his will, who stood toe-to-toe with presidents and gangsters, and who, in the end, was undone by the very world he had mastered. Not by a bullet in public, not by a government trial, but by a few whispered words behind closed doors, a silent nod, a ride he never returned from. Jimmy Hoffa's life was a force of nature. His disappearance became something even greater, a haunting, a reminder that even the most powerful can vanish in the blink of an eye, and that sometimes the greatest mysteries are never solved. Decades have passed since Jimmy Hoffa vanished, and still his shadow lingers. In union halls, in mob histories, in FBI files gathering dust, and in the restless imagination of America, Hoffa remains a man who refused to disappear quietly. Even today, his name stirs something primal. Power, defiance, mystery. Every few years, a new headline grabs attention. New tip in Hoffa case. FBI digs again for Hoffa's body. Deathbed confession may reveal Hoffa's final resting place. And every time, the same result. Nothing concrete. Just whispers. Just more smoke. But it's not just the mystery of his end that keeps Hoffa alive in the American psyche. It's what he represented. He was a man who rose from the working class, clawed his way to the top without apology, and fought sometimes brutally for the dignity of ordinary people. He was, in many ways, a symbol of American ambition. A kid from nothing who stared down presidents and gangsters and bent the world to his will. And yet, Hoffa's story is also a warning. It shows the razor-thin line between ambition and obsession, between loyalty and betrayal, between power and doom. He lived by codes: loyalty to the Union, loyalty to the Brotherhood, but those same codes became the chains that dragged him under when trust dissolved and the knives came out. For the Teamsters, Hoffa's name remains complicated. A symbol of strength and corruption, victory and scandal, hero and villain. For organized crime historians, Hoffa's disappearance is the ultimate cold case. A perfect crime, never solved, never fully understood. For writers, filmmakers, and musicians, Hoffa is a rich well of inspiration, a modern-day king whose fall was Shakespearean in its inevitability. In the end, Hoffa got what every powerful man secretly fears and secretly desires. He became legend, not merely for what he did, but for how he left. No goodbyes, no last words, just the silence of a man who once made the world tremble, swallowed by his own history. In every rusted-out parking lot, every empty stretch of highway, every lonely restaurant booth where an old-timer still whispers about what really happened, Hoffa's spirit flickers. Gone, but not forgotten. Jimmy Hoffa didn't just disappear. He became something greater, an eternal question.